Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos with us now. Miss Secretary DeVos, great to have you with us.
It's great to be with you, John. Good morning.
Good morning, and so much to talk about today. Let's start with the school situation, schools being closed. A couple of questions on it. I know you're working very hard. Do you see the public school system reopening in August?
Well, I think there's a good possibility, depending on where you are in the country. I think it's a very good possibility, and obviously President Trump and his administration has released all of the phasing and criteria for reopening different parts of the economy and the country. But right now, we know that most kids across the United States are learning at home, and we know this was not a planned event for any of them. But it's been really heartening to hear about how local communities have banded together, and educators and education leaders have worked really hard to meet the needs of their students.
Ms. Secretary, how would you rate the ability of schools in the nation in the last 30 days to transition to internet distance learning?
Well, it's been very, very uneven and spotty, as one might imagine. This was certainly not anticipated by most schools across the country. And I'm, again, very encouraged by those who have grabbed hold of the opportunity and the challenge and done really important and good things for students in their communities. I'm also very saddened and concerned about the districts and the schools that have just said, this is too hard, we're not going to do it at all. Because it's the kids who are suffering as a result. We know that learning can and does happen many different places, and it can happen, and it is happening at a distance. And we need to ensure that all kids have that same opportunity.
Secretary DeVos, what do we do? There's a lot of areas in the United States. I'm going to mention one as an example, the Delta in Mississippi. My older son, Jack, teaches there in a high school, West Tallahatchie. He's telling me that up to 50% of his students don't have access to high-speed internet of any kind in the Delta. What are our plans short-term in order to allow those students the same opportunity as other students in parts of the nation that have a better internet connectivity?
Sure. Well, learning doesn't have to happen only via the internet. There are schools and districts and communities that are doing distance learning in a more traditional, more paper and packet-oriented way, with teachers calling their students and having office hours by phone and various approaches that are more low tech. But it can happen, and it does work. In the meantime, there are many communities that are also working hard to get that additional technology to their students. But it doesn't have to be a light switch. It can be a phased approach too. But the key is that it's really important for kids to be able to continue doing their learning. And educators have the opportunity to really take this challenge and do with it everything in their power and everything possible on behalf of their students. And I'm seeing it happen in many, many different communities and states, and I know that there are others who are working very hard to get up to speed. But this is a challenging time. Everybody acknowledges that. And for parents who suddenly find themselves as homeschool parents, I know that this is a daunting time. And I think we all need to allow ourselves to take a few deep breaths and acknowledge that it's not going to be the same as going into a classroom on a daily basis. But there are so many different ways to learn and so many different opportunities to learn new things that kids might not have even anticipated.
You're on the John Fredericks Radio Network, Trucking the Truth Across America. We're with Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos. Secretary DeVos, let's get to your decision to halt collection of student loan debt for the time being. How do you see this working?
Well, we know that students are faced with unforeseen expenses and loss of income in many cases. It was important to ensure that they were not going to continue to accrue interest and be required to continue paying down their student loans for a period of time. President Trump acted very early on this and gave a 60-day, a 2-month suspension there. Congress in the CARES Act extended that to 6 months. So it's an important piece of ensuring that in the long run, when the economy is able to open up again, that students are going to be well positioned to continue their learning and to continue and to resume their payment at a time where they're going to be able to have, where the economy is going to be able to sustain that.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Secretary, let's go to the high schools now. Interscholastic athletics. This is a real issue, Ms. Secretary, as you know. There's a number of incoming and outgoing seniors now, especially when you look at football, high school football, going into the fall practice. A lot of these states start in August, the end of July. They need that senior term in order to play, to get a D1, D2 football scholarship, or soccer if it may be in the fall. Baseball went through this shutting down and at the end of March. Will any provisions be made? Will there be an opportunity to reclass? Has your department thought any of that through?
Well, those are very good questions.
Thank you.
And frankly, the Department of Ed does not deal with high school athletics specifically. But this is something, in concert with the CDC guidelines and the athletic associations, this is going to have to be a point of discussion. Clearly, I know that for seniors who missed their spring sports and spring term activities, this is very disappointing, and it certainly does throw a wrench into their longer term plans. This is over the course of the next couple of months, I'm sure there's going to be very focused discussion around how to ensure that these rising seniors are able to, play their sports in some fashion through the fall and winter terms. And I'm sure they're going to do it in consultation with the CDC guidelines and those in the medical and science fields that will be able to guide on how to do that safely.
They don't call him the commander of common sense for nothing.
I'm not a wholly owned subsidiary of the Republican National Committee, the Democrat National Committee, any campaign or anybody else. So I'm going to call it like I see it.
Guess who got out of the wrong side of the bed this morning?
Make sure to get your big boy pants on. No crybaby diapers.
There's no crying in baseball.
Here on the John Fredericks Show.
One issue that I really wanted to ask you, you came into the administration from outside politics. You weren't a candidate. You didn't get involved in that. You've made some very effective and very bold moves in the Department of Education, but you have come under intense criticism from the fake news media and many others. And without having a political background, you were in business, didn't ever run a campaign or come under that kind of scrutiny. How have you been able to stand up to that?
Well, just a little additional information to what you have. I was involved in Republican Party politics for many years in Michigan. So I did have some experience with the rough and tumble of campaigns, but clearly did not have, the kind of preparation that one might want or need when coming to Washington, D.C. But with respect to the attacks and what I think the media just gets wrong about education in general is they just have a knee-jerk defense of the status quo and a very narrow lens through which they're looking at education. I have talked for decades now about the necessity to rethink education at every level, but primarily the K-12 years, where we've done it the same way for over 100 years, essentially the same way. And yet everything else around us has changed in over the last century and a half. And it is this reality today with the COVID virus as a invisible enemy invading our country is forcing us to do things differently, and it's forcing education to do things differently. And there are going to be many silver linings, I believe, to this situation, because I think people are going to realize that there are many different ways that you can learn and many different places and many different circumstances under which you can learn. And so this is, I'm hopeful that the media will actually come around to seeing this as well. But I think that gives just a little bit of background from my perspective on what the media continues to get wrong.
So talk about some of the silver linings that you said might come out of this as it affects change for the good in public education in America.
Well, I think that knowing that you can use technology effectively and in ways that don't necessitate all being together in one place at one time, that students can actually if students were allowed to move ahead in some of their studies at a pace at which works for them, and demonstrate how they have mastered material or how they're competent in a certain subject area, and then be permitted to keep moving on, so that you don't hold students who are quicker moving in one subject back. While if it takes a little longer for that same student in another subject area, they have that opportunity. And there's been a lot of work going on around this competency-based mastery education for a number of years, but the system is very slow to take up some of these new approaches simply because it's hard to change and the status quo is defended at all costs. And I think we can start looking at, and many of the conversations I've had with education leaders in the last several weeks have actually pointed to this, that instead of measuring the amount of time a student spends in a seat, maybe we should be looking at what they're actually able to achieve in whatever time it takes them to achieve it.
What is the genesis of the wanting to stay with the status quo at all cost, even when all the numbers say that it's failing? What is the impetus behind that? I mean, why would people stay with something that's not working when you've got evidence? You take charter schools, for instance. I know you've been a tremendous advocate of charter schools, which gives parents choice. And you have a lot of parents, single-family homes and others, that simply don't have the means to move out of the school district and go someplace else. But they do have the ability to send their child to a better performing school if they so choose. What is the agenda of those that want to keep the status quo in education while you're fighting for changes to get better results?
Well, because I think it's, number one, it's hard to change. People get comfortable in a system or a situation that works for them. And it's generally a system more focused around the interests and the focus is more on adults and on their needs, and a system that protects itself than it is on doing what's right for students. Mm-hmm. And we see this consistently, particularly with students who are the most vulnerable. Our nation's report card, the most the most comprehensive look we have at how students across the country are doing, continue to prove this out. The students at the bottom end of the performance spectrum, the 10th and 25th percentile, the gap continues to grow as compared to students at the 90th and 100th percentile. And this, in spite of the fact that over the last 40 years, we've spent over $1 trillion at the federal level alone with the specific goal of closing that achievement gap between the highest and lowest performers. It's not only not narrowed one little bit, it's actually widened in some measures. And so it really does beg the question why we continue to insist on doing things the same way instead of trying some of these different things and allowing and giving parents more control and power over choosing where their kids go to school and what type of experience those kids have.
Tell you what, it just makes no sense when you take what you're just saying, why we would be defending a status quo in public education in the United States that, like you say, the gap is growing. You're on the John Fredericks Radio Network. Only got a couple more minutes. I'm with Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. Secretary DeVos, let me ask you, if you were to rate now No Child Left Behind, looking back and at the testing system, and you were to rate that now, not to be an armchair quarterback, how would you rate that?
Well, I think the efforts, frankly, at the federal level, both under President Bush and President Obama, there were carrots and sticks. They were all very well intended. I don't criticize the intentions at all, both with the goal of helping students achieve, particularly students at the low end of the spectrum, achieve more. The problem is you cannot lay a one-size-fits-all approach over this entire nation and over every student in this country. Students at the people who are closest to the students, starting with the parents, I would argue, are the ones who know what those students need most and what will work best for them. And that's why I have advocated for more than 3 decades for empowering parents to make those decisions and giving them the opportunity to choose the environment that will be the right fit for their child. And I see, first of all, there are more and more states that are embracing these sorts of approaches for families and students. And I really think that this stretch of time with the virus and all of the requirements because of it is going to help those who have been resistant to some of these changes perhaps think differently about how we do things going forward. And that's why I'm very hopeful that we are going to have a number of silver linings as a result of this time period. And people are going to understand that students can learn differently and in different places and under different circumstances. We just have to allow those, set the framework up to give those at the local level and parents the most power to make those choices.
Secretary DeVos, final question. In your next 6 months, what is your number one priority? What is the one thing Betsy DeVos, above all else, wants to get done?
Well, I'm not sure I can limit it to just one. We have clearly right now we have to distribute. We have to get $31 billion that was appropriated under the CARES Act to the right places with the right intentions, and that starts with a focus on students and helping them and doing what's right for them. And then secondly, we have some important regulations that have been in process that we need to get finalized. And then thirdly, and really importantly to me, is to continue to make the case for education freedom and education choice through our proposal, the Education Freedom Scholarship Initiative, which would help states create a lot more choices for families and students.
You know, I have to ask this question, even though I don't expect an answer, but I believe Trump is going to get reelected for a second term. If that was to happen, would you be willing to stay as Secretary of Education in a second Trump term?
Well, I don't want to get ahead of myself, or certainly not ahead of President Trump. I have been so privileged to serve as Education Secretary this term, and I am going to continue to stay focused on all of the things that we need to do now, and including hoping and helping him get reelected. And it will certainly be up to him what he would like to see in the future. But I want to serve the students of this country well and finish strong whenever that might be.
Well, hopefully that'll be in December of 2024. I hope you stay on. Secretary Betsy DeVos, Secretary of Education, I really want to thank you for your time today. Thank you for all you're doing in this very trying time for all of us. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be with you today, John. Appreciate it.
All right, Secretary